Okay, so you start with initial contact phase. We have some beautiful muscle activation for your trunk extensors. Your pelvis is 5 degrees of forward rotation, muscle activation of glute medius. Kinematics of your hip is 20 degrees of flexion, muscle activation of glute max and hamstrings. And your knee is 0 to 5 degrees of flexion, your quadriceps are activated. And next we move on to your ankles, which is neutral. Your tibialis anterior is firing, and critical event is that beautiful heel strike.
In loading response, the trunk is erect, the trunk extensors are activated, pelvis is forwardly rotated, glute medius is activated, and the hip is at 20 degrees of flexion, gluteus maximus and the hamstrings are activated, the ground reaction force is anterior, and a critical event is hip stability. At the knee's at 15 degrees of flexion, the quadriceps are activated, ground reaction force is posterior, and the critical event is controlled knee flexion. And at the ankle, we have 5 degrees of plantar flexion, tibialis anterior is activated, ground reaction force is posterior, and the critical event is controlled ankle plantar flexion.
Okay, next we have men's stance, where we have these beautiful trunk extensors, 5 degrees of forward rotation. Glute medius is activated, 20 degrees of hip flexion, with some glute max activation. We also have hip stability. Next we move on to the knee. With the knee, we have 15 degrees of flexion. Yours is not 15 degrees flex. There we go. And we have 5 degrees of dorsiflexion with activated gastrocs. Next we have tibial advancement and heel and next.
And now we are in terminal stance. The trunk kinematics are erect, the extensors and the abdominals are activated. In the pelvis, there's 5 degrees of backward rotation, 7 degrees of pelvic drop, 4 degrees of anterior tilt. Muscle activation is gluteus medius. In the hip, there's 20 degrees of extension in the reference leg. Ground reaction force is posterior for kinetics. And the critical event is the trailing limb. For the knee, it's in 0 to 5 degrees of flexion. The ground reaction force is anterior. And then the ankle is 10 degrees dorsiflexed. Gastroc soleus is activated. The ground reaction force is anterior. And the critical event is ankle dorsiflexion with heel rise.
Okay, so next we have pre-swing. In pre-swing, we have an erect trunk. Your extensors and abdominals are firing. Your pelvis is about 5 degrees of rotation backwards, 7 degrees of pelvic drop, and 14 degrees of anterior tilt with your glute medius activating. Next, we have hip extension of 20 degrees. And then we're going to move on to your trailing. So back to this knee, we have 40 degrees of flexion with your passive knee flexion of 40 degrees, plantar flexion of your ankle of 15 degrees, gastroc and soleus is firing with rapid ankle plantar flexion.
In initial swing, the trunk is erect and the extensors and abdominals are firing. The pelvis is in 0 degrees of rotation. The hip kinematics are 15 degrees of flexion, and rectus femoris, adductor longus, and iliopsoas are activated. The critical event in the hip is flexion to 15 degrees. In the knee is in 60 degrees of flexion, and the critical event is 60 degrees of knee flexion. And in the ankle, there's 5 degrees of plantar flexion, and tibialis anterior is activated.
So next we're going to move on to mid-swing. In mid-swing, we have 0 degrees of rotation in the pelvis. We move on to the hips, and we have 25 degrees of flexion, and our hamstrings are activated. The critical event of this one is 25 degrees of hip flexion. Next, we're going to move on to our knee, where we also have 25 degrees of flexion, and our hamstrings are still firing. Next, we move on to our ankle, which is nice and neutral. Tibialis anterior is firing, and we have a neutral dorsiflexed ankle.
And finally, in terminal swing, the trunk is erect and trunk extensors are activated. The pelvis is in 5 degrees of forward rotation, and gluteus medius is activated. The hip is in 20 degrees of flexion, gluteus maximus and the hamstrings are activated. The knee is in 0 to 5 degrees of flexion, and the quads and hamstrings are activated. And then the critical event here is knee extension. The ankle is in a neutral position, and tibialis anterior is active.